Okay, this is a bit longer of a section, but this one is gonna be chapter 20, section 3. Still looking at the main learning target of how how government businesses and employees affect the business cycle and what the business cycle is. Section 3 deals all with labor and management and how, like labor unions and business management. So by the end of the section, you will be able to analyze why labor unions first formed and how labor unions and management interact. In the past, originally in the US, there were first local economies. Local economies were like the economies that you see if you were to go to Old World Wisconsin. Rural, very small communities, tight-knit communities. Most people worked on homes or on farms and that they owned, and if they had a store, they bought stuff from the local farms and sold it to people around them. A lot of times they were selling goods to their neighbors. There were very few employees because the person who had stores or who had a farm owned that farm. They didn't hire people, they just worked what they could. Or if they owned a store, they were the person working in the store. Workers oftentimes knew their employees or their employer if they were hired to work at a different store or if they were hired to work by somebody, and workers could individually speak with the owner of the company if they were dissatisfied, if they didn't like what was going on. There were more jobs for workers, and so employees were treated fairly because, hey, you had a farm, you needed this work to be done. If it didn't get done, your crops went bad, and so workers always had jobs, and they were treated fairly because they could always go find somewhere else to work if they were being treated unfairly. After that, factories started to pop up between 1800 and 1850, especially in the northern U.S. That changed how labor in the U.S. was from that point forward. Factories employed hundreds of people at once, including children, as you can see in this picture up at the top. Owners of these factories didn't really interact with the employees at all. They had very long working days, a lot of times working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And it was very difficult to leave your job because if you left your job, there wasn't many factories, there weren't many places that would employ you because you didn't have the other skills that you would need that you would have learned if you were working on a farm, and you were working for a very low wage, so you couldn't afford to just up and move if you didn't like the conditions that you were working in. This led to the rise of labor unions in the late 1800s. Labor unions are organizations of workers that help workers get better wages and working conditions. Workers believed that they needed this idea of a national labor union to be powerful enough to deal with these employers that they were working for. National labor unions worked to show employers that they should collectively bargain with the employees, which means that all of the employees would agree to something at a meeting, and they would have one person go talk to the owner of the factory or the manager of where they were at, and that person would argue based on what the entire group decided. When collective bargaining happens, these two people will sign an agreement, and that is a binding contract for all of the employees in that union. When the contract comes to the point when it comes close to ending, the employers and the representatives of the union will meet again and form a new contract. There are a couple different methods that labor unions used to get what they wanted. The first one is a strike. Strike is when people in that labor union decide that they are not going to work until the demands of the union are met, which means production completely stops and the company loses money until it can form an agreement. Picketing is when strikers walk back and forth in front of the company preventing new employees from being hired. If that's these examples over here. A lot of times strikes and picketing go hand in hand, and occasionally there would be fights between these two groups, between the strikers, the people that were on strike and picketing, and people that were trying to break the strike and be hired because they could be hired for a lower wage than, or they would be hired, whereas the strikers would want a higher wage, the strike breakers would take whatever wage the company was offering, and it was oftentimes less than what the strike breakers would, or what the strikers would want. The law now makes it, now there is now a specific limit on the number of strike breakers that an employer can use. Another method that employees can use is a slowdown, which is when employees still work, but they work slower than normal. It means that the company loses money because less is being produced, but those people that are on the slowdown can theoretically lose their job because they aren't working to what they should be. Job action is any action for a short-term strike, and this in job action they have to follow all the rules. A lot of times with slowdowns, the way a company will cause a slowdown is that they'll follow every single rule. A lot of companies, even today, even though there are massive amounts of regulations and rules, they don't follow every single rule because it takes more time. Companies will do anything that they can to slow down or to speed up production, and so if a union is using a slowdown as a method of getting what they want, they will follow all the rules, they'll recheck their work, they'll do anything in their power to slow down production. Another one that's not on here but is a lot of times used today is a walkout. Walkouts are when employees just decide to literally walk out in the middle of their shift. It's theoretically supposed to get the employers to want to negotiate because now they don't have any workers and hey, they don't know what to do. A big issue with that is that people that walk out can be fired because, at least in the state of Wisconsin, if you walk out, you can be fired because Wisconsin is what's called a right-to-work state. Sometimes, though, the mere talk of a walkout will get a company's managers to start negotiating, start talking, and figuring out how to improve situations because they don't want their employees to walk out. Companies don't want to have to hire entirely new staffs, and so companies, if they hear of a walkout, they will a lot of times negotiate, trying to get what the employees want. Some methods used by employers to get what they want. So these are all methods used by labor unions to get what they want when negotiating with employers. Now we're going to look at how employers what methods they use to negotiate with employees and with labor unions. First one, a lot of times employers form organizations to combat labor unions, and employers can do one of the options that they would take is they would hire strike breakers. Strike breakers would replace workers that were on strike. They would sometimes hire private police to protect strike breakers, or they would hire security to protect strike breakers, make sure that they weren't hurt as they were crossing the picketers. Another method that they used is blacklists. Employers would create lists of people who were in labor unions that they did not want to hire, and they would distribute these lists to each other. People on a blacklist wouldn't be hired by any employers. Other methods that employers would use is employers would lock their employees out, preventing them from working. It stops a slowdown, but it also stops production entirely. So employers are less likely to use a lockout because they're not making any money, but it also means that anybody who was working for them is also not getting paid to work at a slower rate. Without wage, workers cannot each, I think that's supposed to be earn wages, and they agree to to return to work like normal because they want a wage, they want money. If you heard in the news anything with the NFL and hiring Colin Kaepernick, that was a possible blacklist. The various NFL owners decided they didn't want to hire Colin Kaepernick, and so they put him on a blacklist. They made it so that they possibly made it so that he couldn't get a job because he was on one of these blacklists, and all the NFL owners agreed that they weren't going to hire him. That was a recent use of a blacklist, although I believe when it came down to it, it was deemed that he was not actually on a blacklist. He just none of the NFL owners wanted him to be in their locker rooms. Closed versus open shops. So there are two different types of labor unions. The first one is a closed shop, and the second one is an open shop labor union. Labor unions a lot of times charge dues that pay for the officials of labor unions to fight employers. Helps feed labor union members' families. It also helps to feed people in a labor union if they are on strike or if they're locked out of working. The two different types of labor unions. The first one is closed shop, when everybody in a factory is part of a labor union. The pink states, minus Wisconsin, and you'll see that one on the next state, are closed shop labor unions. They're states that allow labor unions to force every person in an industry to be part of it, whether you want to or not. You are not allowed to be hired for certain industries unless you first become a member of that labor union. Employers really don't like closed shop states because it means that everybody in their work is part of a labor union, and thus if a labor union calls for a walkout or a lockdown or a strike or a slowdown, every single employee will be part of it. The second type of state, which is the green states, including Wisconsin though, those are open shop states, which means that anybody can be hired. You don't actually have to be a part of a labor union. Labor unions are still around, but you don't have to be part of that labor union if you are a member, if you work at that company. Union shops are places that employers can hire any qualified worker, union or non-union. They must join the union after being hired, though. So if in a union state an employer hires somebody that's not part of the union, then that new worker has to join the union in order to keep their job. Agency shops are places where workers cannot be forced to join the union, but they must still pay union dues. So in an agency shop state, or in a place that has agency shop unions, regardless on if you're part of the union or not, that part of your pay is automatically taken out. So regardless, you are paying union dues whether you are in the union or not, which encourages all the workers to join the union because you're already paying for it. You might as well get the benefits of it, but you don't have to be part of the union. And the reason that agency shop is an idea is because workers are getting the benefits of the union is helping them, and so they might as well pay for it whether they want to be a part of the union or not. And benefits from the union regardless if they're a part of it. Yeah. Today there's also this idea of right to work states, which are all the red states. And right to work states means that you have the right to work and you cannot be forced to join a union. Unions still are around, but you have the right to work whether there is a union or not. There is also the opposite side of a right to work state where you have the right to work, but you also have the right to not work. If you don't like what's going on, you don't have to work there. You have the right to work, or you have the right to not work. Now, AFL versus the CIO. The AFL and the CIO were both labor unions in the early 1900s. American Federation of Labor was a large craft union. It spanned a whole bunch of different companies and crafts. And the CIO was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a large industrial labor union. A lot of workers, and these two unions covered many of the same industries, and a lot of workers were torn between whether they should join the AFL or the CIO. But in 1955, they combined to form the AFL-CIO, which is still a union today, and it is the largest American labor union today, with over 13 million members nationwide. Now, some problems with unions. The AFL and the CIO are a great example of multiple unions forming within one company. They compete for members, and thus they make it harder for the unions to get what they want. And members will sometimes refuse to join either union because those two unions are in a conflict. National unions, one issue that national unions have is that they are divided into local unions, and local union leaders might disagree with what the national union has decided, and so if the national union says to go on strike, but a local union says we don't want to go on the strike, then the local union might not go on strike, which then hurts the national union's idea. Or vice versa, the local union might decide it wants to go on a strike, but the national union has already agreed on terms, and so the national union will not put them on strike. Recent union organization. In the 1960s, a lot of hospital and migrant farm worker unions formed. In the 1970s, there were government unions that formed. Federal employees, teachers, police, air traffic controllers have all gone on strike in the past, and even though there have been laws preventing these kind of strikes. Less Americans are part of unions today, as you can see by this little graph. The graph in the early 1900s, there was about 11%. It peaked in, I want to say that was the 1920s. In the 1930s, nobody was part of a union, and throughout World War II, union membership spiked. At the end of World War II, it spiked again up to 33% of Americans were part of unions. And since then, it's slowly gone down to, these numbers were in 2017, it was at 10.7%, which is less than in 1917. In 2001, when the textbook was written, 13.5% of American workers were part of labor unions. They still have a lot of strength in manufacturing and industries, but in other areas they have less strength. Some labor laws. So Congress has passed a whole bunch of laws dealing with labor and management relations, or union management relationships, and it has done this to protect workers or protect the public from strikes, because when a company goes on strike, then the public doesn't have that good because it's not being produced. It also prevents unfair practices by employers, because employers can't take advantage of their employees. And this is done to ensure that the nation, and it also ensures that unions are run democratically, because unions are not a dictatorship. If you join a union, you are guaranteed fair representation in that union. First one was the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, which was passed by Congress in 1935 during the Great Depression. It guaranteed the rights of workers to organize unions and bargain collectively. It set up the National Labor Relations Board to judge the fairness of activities of the union and employers towards each other. So it formed the National Labor Relations Board, which made sure that unions and employers were both fair, and guaranteed workers the right to form unions, because before then, a lot of presidents were union busters or trust busting presidents. They did not allow for the formation of unions. The Labor Management Relations Act, also called the Taft-Hartley Act, was passed in 1947, shortly after World War II, and it allowed the President of the United States to order a union to delay a strike for 80 days if the strike would threaten national welfare. This was because the President should have the ability to make sure unions don't go on strike if the nation is currently being threatened by another country, or if the strike would hurt the nation as a whole. So actually today, if pharmacies had a union, or if the trucking union, that's actually a better example, if the trucking union were to go on strike today, the President of the United States could order the trucking union to delay its strike by 80 days because the nation is in the middle of this pandemic. It could make sure that the trucking union doesn't go on strike until after the pandemic is over, and then the trucking union could go on strike and it would be fine. The Taft-Hartley Act also outlawed closed shops and feather bedding. Feather bedding was when unions forced employers to hire more workers than they needed to. Now, that's even though the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed both of those things. Closed shops, there were still closed shops for certain industries, or they would actually have going back a decent ways, they would have the agency shop, where you had to pay union dues regardless on if you were part of a union or not. In Wisconsin, actually, the teachers union had an agency shop before Wisconsin became a right-to-work state, and so teachers were forced to pay dues for the teachers union, even if they did not want to be a part of the teachers union. I actually had my economics teacher in high school complain about that all the time because he did not want to be part of the teachers union, but he had to pay the dues, and so he was part of the teachers union solely because he was already paying the dues, and so he might as well be a part of the union anyways. And feather bedding was still used, but in a different way. So up until I'm gonna actually tab out so that I can look. I'm gonna close this so that I can look this up. But Chicago had lead pipes and unions. Chicago had the union had forced Chicago lead piping in the Chicago Plumbers Union in the 1980s. So prior to the federal legislation that later in that decade overruled local legislation. Okay, so yeah, in Chicago, they were still putting lead pipes in the city, even in the 1980s, after lead was known to be toxic, because the labor union used this idea of feather bedding to force the plumbing companies, the water treatment companies, the water companies to put in lead pipes. They didn't feather bed and say that the companies had to hire more workers. They used feather bedding in the idea that the unions forced the plumbing companies to put in lead pipes because one person could carry a copper pipe or a PVC pipe, whereas it required two people to carry a lead pipe because lead pipes were much heavier. So even though feather bedding and open and closed shops were both outlawed in 1947, they were still being used in other forms in newer U.S. history. The Taft-Hartley Act also allowed states to pass right-to-work laws. The next one, the third one that we're going to look at is the Landrum-Griffin Act. The Landrum-Griffin Act was passed in 1959 to prevent abuses by labor unions. Before this, between 1947 and 1959, labor unions started to abuse their power and make it so that the industries were having a harder time making profits because the labor unions were so powerful. Remember, that is going back. It is during this time period, from about where that point is until right about here where this drop is. That is the time when the Taft-Hartley Act was around, and where that drop happens, that is where the Landrum-Griffin Act comes in. It prohibited convicted criminals from becoming union officers for 5 years after being released from prison. It also said that members of the Communist Party had to wait 5 years before becoming union officials, and it guaranteed secret ballots in union elections. So that's this idea of, okay, now employers are getting the better end of the deal as opposed to employees. Today, modern labor unions leaders realize that companies need to make a profit, because without the company making a profit, then they'll just send their business to a different country. If the demands of the labor union are too high, the company goes out of business, or it moves its business to another country, and the jobs are lost anyways. So leaders have to cooperate with companies to run a more efficient business. Modern employers know that workers must also have good wage, because if a worker does not have a good wage, then they cannot pay for things that the company has. That was actually in the 1910s, when Ford had the Model T. I think it was 1910s or 1920s, early 1900s, when Ford had the Model T. Ford gave his workers 1 day. He gave them 2 days off. He gave them that was when we start seeing Saturday and Sunday, and his workers were first off paid a decent wage, and they had Saturday and Sunday off. Sunday was so that they could go to church, and Saturday was so that they could go to a car dealership and buy a Ford. So modern employers know that employees have to have good wages in order to pay for stuff. And if they have bad working conditions, then employees will go somewhere else to work. Some companies share profits with the workers, and some companies allow workers to decide their schedules. Employers try to make their employees satisfied, so that the employees stay. And employees that are satisfied produce more, are absent less, and feel more needed. So if an employee is happy, they do a better job at work. Collective bargaining today is collective bargaining today solves a lot of labor and management issues, because there are very few strikes, but it's not, or collective bargaining today allows it so that labor unions and management have less issues and there are less strikes, because the labor unions will mediate and find a better solution to the problem. So in 1994, there was a strike by the Major League Baseball players, where that was one of the last times in major sports that there was a strike. In 2011, the teachers union in Wisconsin went on strike, and both sides in both of those strikes, they ended up mediating. They had the leaders of the different unions come together and form an agreement. Mediation is when they find that agreement. So mediation is just a recommendation. It's not a legally binding contract. Mediation is just a formal or an informal agreement between the labor union and the industry. Arbitration is very similar to mediation, but arbitration is when the government steps in and says, hey, you two need to form an agreement. The labor union and the company have to find an agreement, and whatever agreement is found, that is a legally binding contract. Collective bargaining decisions have collective bargaining is more powerful for labor unions, because collective bargaining decisions have a powerful influence on the country's prosperity and its future, because if collective bargaining makes it so that workers have a super high wage, then the industries leave. If it allows companies to run over their employers, then there's a lot of industry, but nobody has good jobs. And so all of this is dealing with and so collective bargaining decisions and the labor management relationships are massive in how the country works, and that all ties into this idea of the business cycle, because if employees are happy and the companies are doing better, then that's how businesses and employees affect the business cycle, making it so that the economy in the U.S. increases. And that's it.